but okay. Okay, thank you again for being here. This morning, my topic is Christian spectacles of persecution, the display of tortured bodies of the faithful, suffering at the hands of non-believers. I explore how such displays become politically and emotionally powerful image narrations for U.S. evangelicals starting in the 1960s. Now, let me say before I start fully that I know the topic of the Institute is Atlantic World and Pacific Rim, so I feel obliged to confess that the geographic framework here is not specifically either. We begin with Congo, which is, after all, in the center of the continent of Africa, and my talk moves toward a global frame. So this afternoon, I'll talk a bit more about why I think such an expanded parameter is useful, but for now, I'll just put it this way. Evangelicals and evangelical culture travel broadly. They're not a community defined by language or region or nationality, although all of these borders play significant roles in the fluid and often intense politics of evangelical globalism. The post-World War II era marks the beginning of the end of the missionary era. Not the end of missionaries, but a fundamental challenge to the presumptions of European and American cultural supremacy that had been at the heart of imperialist missions. In the vacuum left by the disintegration of the logic of missionary benevolence, American evangelicals begin to see persecution not as an exceptional event, but as something inevitable, inherent, and ongoing. In addition to tracing the increasing centrality of persecution to evangelical self-conception, I'll also show how, over the last part of the 20th century, the site of prototypical persecution moves southward. At mid-century, the iconographic and battled faithful were missionaries. By the 1990s, persecution discourse posits Christians in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere as exemplary, embodying an idealized form of Christian practice. Their idealization is linked to the fact that they are increasingly marked as persecuted for their faith. So it is that the suffering body, the body of individual Christians, and the body of Christ becomes located in the global South. Now, neither persecution nor the contemplation of it are new, of course. The veneration of martyrs was a rich practice in early Christianity in which images, statues, relics, and sermons served as forms of Christian education, invoking fear and bravery, suffering and steadfastness. St. Augustine told his readers that when they went to church and heard the stories of church martyrs, they should engage them not in terms of their awfulness, which would nonetheless be recounted in great detail, but in terms of the completeness of faith they represented. And visuality was a central part of this completeness. Augustine writes, "A splendid spectacle offered to the eyes of the mind is a spirit whole and unbroken, while the body is torn to pieces. That is what you people gaze upon with pleasure when accounts of such suffering are read in church. After all, if you didn't form some picture of what happened, it would mean you weren't listening at all." Forming a picture of what happened. Already, Augustine makes clear that persecution is made visible through media practice, even though the media he has in mind is the sermon. Martyr veneration is also part of Protestant print culture in Europe. In fact, the image on the slide is from Fox's Books of Martyrs, the first edition of which is in 1559. Media were central, too, in the spectacles of suffering that were such an important part of anti-slavery politics in the 19th century U.S., as the bodies of slaves were displayed as anti-abolitionist rhetoric. Still, you see here, this is just one of the many examples, but this is a quite famous example of a slave who is, distinctly shown in body, right? You wouldn't necessarily have to have the body in that way, but they do, and this is a very famous image here. You have it as an anti-slavery medallion made by Wedgwood, the now things for plates and cups, but this circulated very broadly. Still, by the early 20th century, excessive attention to martyrs, particularly contemplation of the racked and wounded flesh, was considered by many Protestants to be a suspect and near idolatrous Catholic practice. The story I tell then is a partial history of the elaboration of late 20th century evangelical Protestant martyrology. This history happens in three registers. First, it's about media, and particularly the small media at the heart of much evangelical public life. Pamphlets, magazines, radio shows, books, and low-budget movies. It's about politics, second. How white evangelicals, and to a lesser degree conservative African-American Protestants, became involved in issues of foreign policy through persecution discourse. This involvement went well beyond, but also included support for the Cold War. And third, it's about faith, the globalizing of U.S. evangelical identity, and the rise of the persecuted body into a spectacular icon of evangelical internationalism. Let me turn to two examples from the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, when two very different evangelical leaders came to be known as Christian martyrs. In 1964, Dr. Paul Carlson was murdered on the streets of Stanleyville, Congo. Carlson was an evangelical missionary serving in a remote region of the country. After most missionaries had been evacuated due to ongoing political instability, he stayed and was eventually taken hostage by rebels who were fighting the Belgian-backed government of Congo, recently independent. The rebels held Carlson for several weeks. In that time, they sentenced him to death several times, then reprieved him, and sentenced him again. All of this made the news so that Carlson was already a figure of some notoriety when he was killed along with 59 other people, mostly Belgian missionaries and businessmen, in a spasm of violence in Stanleyville. Carlson was one of only 2 Americans to die that day, and he immediately became a national icon. Carlson's story, which most of you probably never heard of, but was a major event at the time, was told in every mainstream media outlet in the country, as well as in several major African-American newspapers. You see here the cover of Life. His death was featured not only in the cover of Time, which you saw, but also in Life, which did not only this cover story, but the story itself was a 16-page spread in the middle featuring shocking photos of the deaths in Stanleyville, and I'm going to show you some more over at Woods here. But you see here, have no scruples, kill them, the kind of very dramatic story that it's telling. You see pictures of children here. You'll see some people dead on the streets. This is Carlson himself. And then the story of his wife, who says that she, tells a reporter that she's going to wait and tell her children tonight at bedtime. So this story of domesticity too. For most of the mainstream media, Carlson was a symbol of the dangers of decolonization. How, quote, good whites were being treated, and I'm going to quote Time here, by dazed, ignorant savages in Africa. By the time of Carlson's death, Congo had been in a political crisis for almost 4 years. In 1960, the nationalist Patrice Lumumba had been elected as the nation's first prime minister. This is a reverential painting by a Congolese nationalist. Then events escalated rapidly. A coup against Lumumba, then his disappearance, and in February 1961, revelations of his murder by the Belgians and their Congolese allies. For some African Americans and many African nationalists, Lumumba's death made him a martyr. Certainly African American media, including religious media like the African American Methodist Episcopal Church's magazine, Voice of Missions, was consistently critical of U.S. policy in Congo, which they saw as far too allied with Belgian colonialism. So one thing just to note here is the Voice of Missions, which is the AME Missions magazine, is talking about policy in Congo in a fairly direct, well, not fairly direct, utterly direct way. After Lumumba's death, there followed a series of unstable governments, rebellions, and violence for several years. And in response to these crises, U.S. missionaries were evacuated 4 times between 1960 and 1964, twice with the aid of UN troops. And the last of these evacuations was the one that Carlson ignored. White evangelicals were riveted by Carlson's death. Billy Graham, the nation's leading evangelist, devoted 2 episodes of his hour-long weekly radio program to the topic. Now, I told you that I was going to talk about small media, but the Billy Graham show was not that. It was carried on the ABC radio network, and an estimated 20 million people heard the show each week. Carlson's death was ultimately recounted in several biographies and at least 3 movies, although admittedly these films were destined for the church basement circuit. Several evangelical organizations also produced their own materials, which describe the suffering of their own missionaries, some of whom were also killed in the event. So Carlson is the famous one, and he's one of only 2 Americans killed that day. But in a lot of the violence surrounding this day and before, the a little bit after, a lot of people were killed. So these individual evangelical organizations talk about their own missionaries and talk about them in very specific ways in terms of their martyrdom. So you see here, tragedy or triumph, they paid the supreme price, love's summit reached. So again, this is a very evangelical language of this is actually not tragedy, this is triumph in dying in the service of God. This is the summit of love for those that you're serving. And these small meetings, they didn't have journalists on the ground, so they just show portraits like this of the people who died. Just show you another one. This is from Pentecostal magazine, which also had people on the ground in Congo. And then another one, the Mennonite brethren, who were an evangelical subset there. Some people argue about Mennonites, but not this particular group. They are clearly evangelical. Then I'm going to show you two slides of the Unevangelized Fields Missions pamphlet. Now, the Unevangelized Field Mission was a small missionary organization that had a big presence in Congo. They lost 9 missionaries in the same period that Carlson died. And they described the deaths of these missionaries in very emotional and moving ways. I'm going to read to you a brief description of the death of the 28-year-old man from this pamphlet, and note just how much it talks about his body. Bill was taken to prison on September 13th, where he died a few days later. This is the rebel prison. He had been tormented mentally and physically by the rebels. On one occasion, they fired 5 bullets past his head. He'd been ill with malaria, and dysentery. When he was mistreated in jail by the rebels, his body could take no more, and the Lord graciously took Bill home. Again, drawing a picture, evoking emotion. Here the emotions are not only horror and perhaps anger, but also a kind of heartbreak mixed with promise. We're reminded that for believers, death should be seen as going home. African American church leaders were no less attentive to the profound symbolism of such visible suffering and to the power of the emotions it evoked. In 1964, after all, the civil rights movement had more than its share of martyrs, and the movement had been deeply conscious of the power of the image. So you see here the images of James Chaney, Michael Turner, and Andrew Goodman, who were murdered in Mississippi just a few months before Carlson was killed in the summer of 1964. Then, in late February of 1965, so 6 months after the folks were killed in Mississippi and a few months after Carlson's death had been such a major item in the news, Martin Luther King announced his plan to march from Selma to Birmingham. The Pittsburgh Courier, which is a major African-American newspaper in this period, carried a story about a group of black churches who were responding to this announcement with a prayer meeting. The meeting made a none too subtle argument about the links between politics at home and abroad. On a particular Sunday, the paper explained, churchgoers would offer concentrated prayer for missionaries and other Christians who were under threat of violence both in Africa and in Alabama. Now, I want to highlight here that religious media consumers were not operating in a bubble. In the 1960s, an AME church member might read her missions magazine on a Sunday, but she's also likely to subscribe to secular black newspapers like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, which carry this missionary and church news very prominently and proudly as ours. And then she's going to watch Ed Sullivan or something like that at night. Similarly, white evangelicals might read Christianity Today over breakfast, read Life in the afternoon, and also watch Ed Sullivan at night. The cross-pollinization of cultural forms was and is part of the quotidian practice of media consumption for most people. That reality complicates any straightforward notion of a subculture, although too often religious studies in particular, and I think others fields too, tend to treat religious people as if they get all their ideas from religious media. The kind of mixed media consumption I'm trying to highlight also complicates any simple version of a universally shared public culture at the same time. That is, people are mixing and matching in different ways the different media available to them. But that's also precisely what makes it so crucial and so difficult for us to parse the knitted together power of media and popular culture. come back to Congo. So, as much as the veneration of Congo martyrs connected with U.S. church history, it also emerged from this particularly fraught situation in Congo. With the coming of political independence in 1960, Congolese had become increasingly vocal about the issues of independence within the churches. In a few evangelical areas, missionaries and the local Christians, many of whom they converted, went into battle, figuratively and literally, for control of the mission schools and moral authority in the churches. The mission schools in particular were a source of, it's hard to explain how upset and how big a deal control of the mission schools was in Congo. And in various parts of the country and in various mission organizations, so it wasn't just one group. Congolese generally argued, or many Congolese Christians argued, that the mission schools had provided substandard education, and they complained too about their treatment at the hands of arrogant and or incompetent missionaries. And sometimes after missionaries evacuated in these various evacuations, they were not welcomed back to their stations. In one case, a group of Congolese who were having conflict with a Baptist missionary group wrote a letter of appeal to President Kennedy, complaining that, quote, your compatriots at the Baptist mission, end quote, were trying to ignore the local church and shut down the mission school. These missionaries, they said, had fled the country and had abandoned their missionary service, only to then return and, quote, to proceed by armed force against our pastors and our churches. Is this the Baptist mission of rifles and cudgels? So Carlson's death happens precisely at a moment when many missionaries were facing profound criticism for having abandoned their mission stations and for their relationship with local Congolese Christians. Understandable as that leaving, as that evacuation might have been, given the real danger the missionaries were in, the decision was also one that some missionaries felt guilty about. There are internal letters and documents from missions organizations in which the missionaries try to justify their departure to those at home. The basic facts were undeniable. Most Protestant missionaries had abandoned their fellow Christians, not once but several times, even though they came back, had abandoned them not once but several times, rather than risk actually becoming martyrs. Carlson had not left, and so in that sense he was an ideal, the proof of a missionary sacrifice that in practice had often been not forthcoming. At the same time, Carlson's death also symbolized for many U.S. evangelicals the bitter reality of modern missions. They saw themselves as under attack everywhere, almost everywhere, by the people they had served, citizens of assertive young nations who insisted on their equality and who no longer, it seemed, wanted to be saved. If in the post-colonial era missionary martyrs were both idealized transnational figures and problematic emblems of discredited hierarchies, then evangelicals might have thanked God for Richard Wurmbrand. A Romanian Jewish convert and a minister, Wurmbrand had been imprisoned twice by the Romanian government for his activities as an underground minister under communism, before he finally escaped to the West in 1964. In 1966, Wurmbrand is asked to testify before a Senate committee that was examining the problem of religious freedom under communism. And standing before the senators and the news media cameras, Wurmbrand stripped to the waist, which is unusual in the Senate, and turned to display his deeply scarred back. My body represents Romania, my country, which has been tortured to a point that it can no longer weep, Wurmbrand said. The marks on my body are my credentials. Later that year, Wurmbrand published what became his best-known book, Tortured for Christ, which eventually became a global Christian bestseller. At the same time, he founded Jesus to the Communist World, an organization called Jesus to the Communist World, which would later become Voice of the Martyrs, and that's a group we're going to come back to. Wurmbrand also made a movie, Tortured for Christ, sometime in 67 or 68. And now, since we fought so hard for the sound, I'm going to show you a clip. Now, the quality is very low. It comes from the Wayback Machine on the internet. And I'm going to show you, he has a strong accent, but I'm going to show you about 2 minutes in which he, for the film, reproduces the spectacle that he did in the Senate. Yes, right back on, sorry.
Opportunities from finding the morning until 10 in the evening, 17 hours a day, we had to sit just like this. We were not allowed to lean. For nothing in the world could we rest a little bit our head. To close your eyes was a crime. 17 hours a day you had to sit like this and hear. Communism is good, communism is good, communism is good, communism is good, communism is good. Christianity is stupid, Christianity is stupid, Christianity is stupid. Nobody more believes in Christ, nobody more believes in Christ. Give up, give up, give up. The days, weeks, years, we have to listen to these things. And now when the worst came, and I don't wish to tell you words, because I know you have much communist propaganda in America, and some don't believe words. I assure you, not my body, I don't boast with my sufferings. I will show you the tortured body of my fatherland and of the underground church behind the Iron Curtain. Just look here. I am an unworthy and an insignificant sinner, and I don't dare to compare myself. But as Jesus showed to unbelieving Thomas the wounds, so I show you, so communists torture Christians. Look here. Look here. Look here to the back, and I can show you the whole body is like this. So communists torture those who believe in Christ, who believe in God. Christians are happy to suffer like this, but it is your duty to fight to stop these sufferings and to sustain with your love the brethren who suffer behind the Iron Curtain for the faith which you yourself have.
There's so much I could say about this, but I'll leave some of it for our discussion. I do want to say that I think it's hard in some way to recreate how shocking this might have been to evangelicals, because it's, you know, as body displays go, we'll see many worse ones. But the fact that he's turning like this, that he's taking off his shirt, that he's really pulling his pants down to show the damage to his body, was very, to use an evangelical word, very convicting for many evangelicals who saw exactly what he wanted them to see, that is, their responsibility to respond to the suffering of that church. So Wormbrand understood explicitly what had been marked implicitly by the canonization of Carlson. In order to become politically relevant, suffering must be made concrete. In the late 1960s, Amnesty International was just becoming a household word, and it was clear from their work that prisoners and torture were at the heart of human rights politics. The emotions invited by human rights images traveled the same territory as Wormbrand: shock, horror, revulsion, and hopeful determination. The articulation of Christians as targeted for human rights violations was a crucial act of legitimization. Now, in my book, I trace the ambivalent but ongoing relationship that evangelicals have to the concept of human rights throughout the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s, as they struggled with how to negotiate the fundamentally universal and secular nature of Human Rights Project with their own interest in persecution, the persecution of Christians specifically. Now, I'm not going to lay out that trajectory today. Instead, in this last part of my talk, I'm going to jump forward to look at the late 1990s into the present. But as I do, before I get there, I want to highlight two significant transformations that will be important to understanding what happens later. First is a significant demographic transformation. From the 1960s, there we go, that was the backup, to the 1980s, the number of Christians outside of Europe and the United States grew significantly. And you'll see here a couple of charts that are from Christian sources, so you also want you to see how Christians themselves, especially evangelical Protestants, know this information. So you can see here a fairly dramatic sense of like the way in which the number of Christians in different parts of the world, global south is going to be in Asia, Africa, Latin America, goes where the Europeans have a major domination, and then by 2010 and by later, the majority of Christians in the world will be not in Europe or the United States. And then there's another kind of similar chart, which I think is quite interesting, which is somehow deciding what the heart of, or the typical Christian is, and how that moves from Jerusalem into Europe, Southern Europe, and how by 2025, it's going to move further and further into Africa. Now, one of the things I want to say is that it's not just this fact that matters, although it does, in terms of the global politics of evangelicalism, but also the knowledge of it. That is, this is a very famous map among evangelical intellectuals, and as we begin to see, evangelicals from the global south are not just more, but they also move into international and national leadership roles in very different ways. And so,
more about how that map was made?
well, what it takes is the numerical heart of where, it sort of averages, where are the most Christians, how many are in Africa, how many are in Latin America, and they try in ways I don't fully understand, but to figure out what the typical Christian is, where the typical Christian lives. And so this is really supposed to be, in the year 30, the typical Christian is living in Jerusalem. Doesn't mean they're all there. And then over time, you see, their argument is that when you take the whole demographics of Christianity and look at where the numbers are, where the most Christians are, this is how it goes. So it's not...
That line coming from the Atlantic coast of Africa, going further to Africa, that just means more and more Africans. That doesn't mean it's more centered towards Central Africa. Right?
More and more Africans, and actually, yes, it moves more into Central Africa over time. And that's because you have, for example, dramatically increasing numbers of Christians in Nigeria, for example, and other places. So what it means is that by 2100, the typical Christian will be, I think it's a little earlier than that, the typical Christian will be a 30-year-old woman in Nigeria. So this is...
Right.
But Northern Europe, or even France and Germany, the whole northern territory is completely north. It's very hard to figure it out.
Well, as in both Americas, right?
Well,
Somehow they're affecting it.
There must be more at work here.
Protestants, 1500s,
Yeah, it is not supposed to be a Protestant trend. World Christian Trends, this is a democratic center of world Christianity. So I think what you're doing is looking at, really kind of counting numbers. And so to say, where are the most Christians? And when you add, okay, how many Christians are there in Africa? How many are there in Latin America? I honestly don't understand exactly how they do the demographics of this. Like, how do they figure out what 3 Latin Americans mean to one person in, England? Because I don't understand demographics very well. But this is, as far as I know, this has not been heavily criticized as inaccurate. It's been generally understood. And Timothy Shaw, who's designed the map, works at Pew for Religion and Public Life. So he's not...
So it's not just some evangelical thing. This is from you.
Yeah. He's at Pew. This is not from Pew. This is from World Christian Trends, but that's a very, respected.
But in the United States Census Bureau, there's something similar with the United States population. In 1790, the geographic population center of the United States was something like 15 miles east of Baltimore. By 1800, it was 15 miles west of Baltimore. Today, it's more or less about 20 miles, or 50 miles, or 100 miles west of St. Louis. So it isn't the case that all Americans are living in St. Louis. Most of us are living on one of the coasts. It's just that we have weight, space versus population centers. Where's the middle?
Theoretically, 0 Christians in Africa, right?
Theoretically, right. At that spot in 2100, there's not a single person living there. It's just that there's an equal number around that.
That makes it the center.
Right. That's weighted in all possible directions in terms of population space.
So
for Latin America and China.
So it evens out, right? So you have the Chinese and the Latin Americans. Thank you for that. Yes, that makes complete sense. So now when you know that the average American lives in St. Louis, you understand that this is both very useful and somewhat problematic. Okay, so one of the things that becomes really important as American and Europeans begin to acknowledge this is They do well before, you know, any of the big publications that secular people know about global South Christianity. It's also the case that Christians elsewhere in the world become very active agents. They move into leadership roles, and those of you who follow the troubles of the Anglican Communion know something about how this has worked. And they also begin to raise awareness of fellow believers about poverty, political crises, and social injustices facing people outside the United States and Europe. So this image is recent, but it's not new in the sense that global South Christians are quite successfully that if they now embody the church, then what happens to their bodies is also happening to the church. And the dramatic increase in American evangelical attention to HIV/AIDS, starting with no less than Franklin Graham, with very complicated policies associated with it, but with raising money and pushing the Bush administration to give more money to HIV/AIDS, comes directly from this. Now, the second transition, in addition to this demographic one, is that starting in the 1980s, evangelicals become increasingly concerned about Islam. After the 1979 hostage crisis and with the increasing visibility of political Islam in the Middle East and elsewhere, Muslims become a more important target of missionary outreach. Sorry, that picture is in the wrong one. So, reaching out to Muslims has a long history, missionary work to Muslims has a long history, but in the late 1980s, the tone begins to change. In 1989, just at the end of the Cold War, the Argentinian evangelist Luis Bush redraws the evangelical map when he declares that from now on, evangelicals around the world should focus their attention on those areas of the world where the majority of the population are, to use his terms, enslaved by Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism, but especially Islam. So part of what this discourse of enslavement does is to once again speak to a human rights discourse while focusing attention on believers in these areas. Well, Christian believers, they are a part of the 1040 window, they're part of the new global Christendom, and they are likely to face, on a daily basis, one of the so-called slave religions. That confrontation makes them highly valued and highly discussed in American as well as global evangelicalism. So let me move forward then to a moment where the focus of U.S. evangelical sentiment has moved southward. And I'm going to start by showing you the video from the same group, the Voice of the Martyrs, that Warren Graham founded. Now this is from 2000. It's a fundraising and kind of documentary mix. You used to be able to have to order it from their website, and you'd be shown in your churches, you'd be shown at conferences. Now it's on YouTube, like everything else. Now, I'm going to explain something about the activism for which this video emerged, but first I'm going to give you a feel for what, by the turn of the century, have become a full-fledged persecuted Christians movement. Now, I'm going to have you look at the clip, hopefully, which runs about 4.5 minutes, so it's long. I used to say it's quite graphic, and then a couple of times when people see this, they're telling me that they don't consider it impressively graphic given Holocaust imagery or other news media imagery, but I think it is.
Imagine, Islamic soldiers force your 10-year-old son to gather wood for a fire. The soldiers pressure him to convert to Islam. When he refuses, he's thrown on the burning wood he collected and left to die.
They told me I would be released if I became a Muslim. I told them that was not possible. I am a Christian, so they threw me on the fire.
Your son escapes, but the scars remain, a reminder of his sacrifice. Imagine, your teenage daughter goes to Bible camp. On the second day, the students are attacked. One of the attackers secures her hands behind her back, while another holds a piece of broken glass to her stomach. She's told to deny Christ.
I did not answer him, so he pressed the glass harder against me. Do you believe your God can help you? He asked.
Gripped with fear, she cries out, "Help me, Lord, I do not want to deny you." Imagine, your pastor has refused to register his church with the government. During the service, he's dragged from the church and beaten by the local police. When the officers find a Bible hidden in his shirt, he's beaten with it.
After returning home, I felt pain all over my body. It was almost numb at the beginning.
but later became so painful that I could not sleep. It is the 5th time he's been arrested. If he's caught again, the police say they will kill him. Every day, thousands of Christians are persecuted for their faith. Hundreds are martyred, about 1 every 3 minutes. They're not heroes or statistics, they're family. In over 40 nations around the globe, our family is assaulted for their testimony of Jesus Christ. In most instances, the persecution could have been averted if they had simply denied Christ. But they didn't, and they won't. In Sudan, an Islamic army set on jihad, or holy war, has systematically targeted Christians. Death and suffering can be seen throughout the countryside. Countless Christians are being displaced within their own country. Fleeing from persecution, they've lost everything, often arriving at refugee camps with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. In spite of heavy persecution, the church in Sudan continues growing at astonishing rates. Many of the believers bear the scars of their faith, but they also bear the testimony to God's faithfulness. Over 500 churches have been destroyed in Indonesia. On the island of Ambon, Christians have been massacred in a so-called religious cleansing by radical Muslims. Facing increased persecution, pastors in Jakarta have encouraged their congregations to stand firm, confident that their suffering is a prelude to coming revival. With the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, many have hailed its defeat, but Christians in North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, or China would disagree. Hmong villagers have been imprisoned in Vietnam and Laos after converting to Christianity. Some have had boiling water poured down their throats for simply possessing a Bible in their own language. The Hmong tribe is the largest in Southeast Asia, numbering 10 million. Meeting secretly at homes, more than 2 million have recently committed their lives to Christ. The persecution facing our brothers and sisters is not a human tragedy. It's a spiritual reality facing the body of Christ. We may not be able to stop the attacks, but we can ease their pain. Through prayer, encouragement, and practical assistance, we can fellowship in their suffering. We can show them that they are not forgotten. It's hard to ignore their pain after you hear their cries.
Heroes or statistics, they are family. They are us, this video invites us to see. Of course, in some important way for Americans, they are also not us. It's the bodies of Black and brown non-Americans up for display here. But importantly for this story, they don't necessarily need to be rescued. Their churches are strengthened in the face of adversity. You heard the story about the church in Sudan growing at remarkable rates. In this particular group, this particular narrative, their suffering then is valuable. It is, to quote the video, the prelude to coming revival. Not infrequently, the Voice of the Martyrs materials quotes the church father Tertullian, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Now, I should say it before I go on that the Voice of the Martyrs is one extreme on the spectrum of people working on persecuted Christians. Most of the people in groups I'm going to be talking about certainly share the sense that the global South Christians would be admired, and they don't want them to see only as victims, they want to see them as us, as part of the body of Christ. But they are interested, most of the American and European activists, in transforming the situation and doing the political work that might help end the persecution. And that's where the political activism that I'm going to talk about comes from. The evangelical self-conception of a we were persecuted has very direct links to U.S. foreign policy. It's both a cause and an effect of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which required the U.S. to monitor religious freedom in the similar ways it monitors human rights. The law was the result of a multi-layered coalition built largely out of conservative think tanks and evangelical organizations. In 1995, legal activist Michael Horowitz galvanized the attention of evangelical elites, really, with an editorial in the Wall Street Journal that listed the atrocities committed by Muslims against Christians in Ethiopia, Pakistan, Sudan, Egypt, and Iran. Christians had too long stood by, he argued, while, quote, in a growing number of other countries, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism has effectively criminalized the practice of Christianity. Horowitz is not a Christian, he's Jewish, but this only gave him more credibility. This was not presumably self-interest talking, but kind of factual recognition. Horowitz also spoke to the zeitgeist at the time. In the next few years, around the period around 1996, 1998, two influential books were published by Christian activists. The Manifesto, In the Lion's Den, Persecuted Christians and What the Western Church Can Do About It, and the more scholarly but nonetheless sensationalist book, Their Blood Cries Out. These two books, both of which highlighted the threat of Muslim nations on the one hand and the countries of the communist remnant on the other, communist remnant is their term, became the source of numbers, stories, examples, and most crucially, frameworks. I sometimes argue that this book, The Blood Cries Out, is kind of like what Fanon's Wretched of the Earth was to left-wing activists in the late 60s, and when people carried it around, it was their framework, it was their proof, it was their legitimization. In 1996, the National Association of Evangelicals, a very large umbrella organization, produced a statement of conscience on religious freedom. And later that year, a small committee organized what was the first International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. In 1997, the year after it first started, organizers claimed that 70,000 churches had received materials on the persecuted church. I have to say that the Southern Baptist Convention was a large part of those, since it had 40,000 member churches and sent out materials to all of them. Now this is from 2001, the International Day of the Church, Persecuted Church. By then, has become focused almost entirely on the problem of Islam. So you have, these are things that you can get the way I did off the web to give to your church. You can order posters. You can get like cards to hand out during the service to organize people to get involved in the International Day of Prayer. This is from 2007. So as early as 1995, the House and the Senate had begun holding multiple and sometimes competing hearings on the issue. You know how like the Senate will hold a hearing and then the House has to hold one, and they have to have different politics. But both proved that they were part of the performance of concern. Congressional allies got very involved in this. In 1998, what the International Religious Freedom Act, what insiders like to call IRFA, was passed by both the House and the Senate. Now, the bill itself has done relatively little to actually change U.S. policy. It requires the president to respond to reports, some of which are written by the State Department, and then it also formed a watchdog organization to also write its own reports because the evangelicals didn't trust the State Department. They thought the State Department would be too concerned with diplomacy and with U.S. interest, and they wanted to be focused more on these kind of moral issues. So the president was required to respond to these reports and to decide every year whether to waive sanctions against violators. In other words, he isn't required to put sanctions in, but he has to make a statement about it. So mostly this has led to the quietly ridiculous yearly performance in which the president sanctions China, pronounces concerns about Sudan, and waives Saudi Arabia. Now, this is only part of the story. In this case, culture and activism not only shaped policy, but the fact of this policy transformed the movement. That is, the International Religious Freedom Act itself created a set of knowledge producers, the required State Department reports, the creation of this Watchdog group, and the International Commission, the Watchdog group, which issues its own reports, and a cadre of activists and intellectuals who go on to create a kind of common sense for evangelicals about the urgent suffering of their fellow believers. In the 2 years after IRFA passed, the Voice of the Martyrs saw its membership increase threefold. Now, after the law passes, and this is the International Committee on Religious Freedom, that's the Watchdog Group's page, it's quite striking to see the charts, graphs, country reports that academic and near-academic institutions begin to produce. So in the last 10 years, there's a kind of remarkable expansion of the information, of the knowledge that's available. So this is their page, and you see you can go and click on different countries and find out what the status of religious freedom is. those of you who got the reading saw another version of this kind of report produced by a different institution. This I just have to show you because it's so remarkable. This, you can see it already, right? This is the martyr chart. So this shows you, I have to wear it. This shows you how many martyrs of what type there were in different years. So these are like a lot of Catholics, obviously, in the early period. And then you get Anglicans and a little strip in the middle, Roman Catholics, still lots of martyrs, some Orthodox, then Protestants here. This is my favorite one, marginal Protestants. And then I don't quite know what non-white indigenous Christians means. I think what it means is what's called African independent churches that are separated out from other Protestant organizations. And by many evangelicals considered a little marginal themselves because they're a little bit syncretic in their theology. But this is the kind of thing you can get. And then a little less bizarre is this kind of chart listing countries of concern in terms of religious freedom. Now, this is available in different forms in many locations, but this one I want to highlight, I got from BlackChristianNewscom. So this will come to a point that I'll come back to. This is not an issue that's limited to white Christians. Now, another factor, of course, is the rise of the internet to social dominance. Many persecuted Christian organizations are either formed in the late 1990s or grew a new life at that point. Now, they're almost always what are known as parachurch organizations. That is, they aren't run by denomination, these persecuted Christian groups, but instead reflect the entrepreneurial and post-denominational cast of much contemporary Protestant life. These groups tended to get on the web quite early. They tend to be small, and it provided an excellent vehicle for allowing these relatively small organizations to get updated images and stories out quickly. So you're able to get, videos, I'll show you in a second, email, even back before the web got this sophisticated, you could get emails and stories delivered daily or weekly to your inbox if you signed up. Now, if you want to work on behalf of persecuted Christians, not surprisingly, you have a broad range of options. Evangelicals are known, like to tell the joke that I think Jews like to tell too, get 83 in a room and you form 4 groups. And that's a little bit true here. You see the Persecution Project Foundation, Christian Freedom International, Christian Solidarity Worldwide. There's another one, there's Christian Freedom International. There's one called Police International. And then the group I'm going to show you here for a second, this is the Voice of the Martyrs page, persecution.com. Most of the other groups have small budgets, like about $1 million a year. Voice of the Martyrs has the largest with a budget of about $45 million a year. Now, as with the videos we saw, the web pages work to evoke emotions, to shock and anger and revolt us. But they also need to uplift and offer hope. I want to take just 1 minute to navigate around one of the sites, which is a very middle level in terms of budget. The group has a budget of about $17 million a year. It's called Open Doors USA. It's formed by another important activist. Do we think I can use this thing? No. Okay. So I'm just going to click rather inelegantly here on, see if it'll open up for me. Maybe. See if it'll let me go back to PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm going to skip that. It won't let me do it, but I'll just ask you maybe this afternoon when we have an internet connection, we can go look at it. But they have, the Open Doors USA has these kind of very interesting different components. So when you go to the website, you go to the North Korea campaign, and that has a video about what's going on in North Korea, pretty sophisticated. And I can't believe they do this stuff on $17 million a year, but I guess they have a lot of volunteers. Then you can go to the Martyrs page and click on different martyrs.
Requires godlike loyalty from all citizens. Worshipping in public or in private is systematic torture. Here in the Bible,
so that would say on the Korea.
Jesus Christ can be a cruel death, and he can.
All right, so I have no idea what's happening there, but let's just hope that I can move forward. So anyway, we'll just look at a little bit more of this, but there's also this game called Undercover Christians, which is We're very cool. I mean, where you can go and like play about how to get Christians out. And then it has the kind of typical interactive map where you can look and see like different countries and what their persecution levels are. Now, though this is an American group, it's also important to stress here that the materials on persecution are not all produced by Americans or Europeans, and it's not a discourse located only in that group. You see, I think it's not going to let me go back to my, let's see if it'll let me just go. Yeah, there we go. Ah! Let me just turn it on. The mystery of the computer, look at that. Every time I try to click, it won't let me do it. There we go. Let's see what happens. All right, so Don't Kill Christians. This is an image from India. People from Iran, Nigeria, China, Brazil write books. They write articles for the U.S. press. They star in videos, DVD, and online. And there are evangelical conferences held each year all around the world, I mean, in Nigeria and other places, but also in the United States and Europe. And there, Christians from around the world arrive as speakers and activists. So they're speaking, they're not just spoken about. And I'm going to show you here, this is another voice of the martyrs. I'm trying to keep a little bit of consistency here at conference. They're not the only ones who do this by any means. And you can see that they have these speakers from around the world, some of whom give names but not faces. And I think this is more of a performance, like Stephen Corey is not, they know who he is and know what he looks like. He has a webpage. So if global South Christians are sometimes treated as if they're voiceless in this persecuted Christian discourse, they just as frequently position themselves, as Wurmbrand did, as models of Christian steadfastness. Now, in conclusion, I'm going to take a minute or just a couple minutes to return to the more directly political concerns of the persecuted Christians. Although activists at the turn of the 21st century, that is in the last 10 years, have been concerned about a range of countries, including Vietnam, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. They actually have tried to get the U.S. to, very hard to get the U.S. to impose sanctions on Saudi Arabia with, as you might not be surprised to know, very little success. Nothing has galvanized their attention like the ongoing conflict in Sudan. Both before and after the passage of IRFA, Sudan was what one observer has called the abiding preoccupation of U.S. evangelical activists. In the U.S. media, the conflict in Sudan has often been understood, only partially correctly, to be one of Muslims versus Christians. Now here I'm not talking about Darfur, but about the war in southern Sudan that was very active from 1988 until 2005, and now there's going to be a vote on whether southern Sudan will be semi-independent. That war was also framed, even less correctly, as Arab Northerners versus Black African Southerners. But both of these frames resonated powerfully in the United States. First, with the rising tide of fears about Islam, which of course only intensified after 9/11. And second, with the politics of race and the history of racial slavery, that Arabs versus Blacks, and it's talked about in those terms. And then we're going to see the Southerners are also described as enslaved, so it carries a very powerful racial connotation. So, crucially, Sudan was an issue that mobilized African American activists, both secular and religious. Starting in the mid-1990s, the Swiss-based group, Christian Solidarity International, started organizing American and European Christians, at first mostly white, to go to South Sudan to buy back women and children who had been taken captive from their villages in the South by northern militias during the war. And they talk about these folks, not entirely inaccurately, as slaves. It's complicated and I could go on about it, but the reason I say not entirely inaccurately is that sometimes people are taken during battle and forced to work as slaves. Sometimes they're sold by their parents who can't take care of them. But there is a very serious traffic in people that goes on between where Southerners are forced to work in Northerners' homes or factories. So the buyback is quite striking. What happens is you go, you take a bunch of money, there's an Arab mediator, or I call them an Arab mediator, somebody from the north who goes and uses that money to buy slaves who were taken in the north and bring them back and restore them to their villages. And there's a lot of controversy about this, whether it creates a market, whether the same people are being bought back over and over again. but it's also been very emotionally powerful for a great many people, both secular and religious, who want to get involved in thinking about this real human rights problem. So I'm going to show you again some very vivid images from persecuted Christian activist sites. So in the late 1990s, Sudan also captured the attention of a group of African American activists, including the talk show host in DC, Joe Madison, comedian Dick Gregory, and others. They describe themselves as the new abolitionists. And in the process of evoking emotionally powerful connections between Sudan and the United States, they also insisted that Sudanese reality be read through the lens of American history. Now, one person who was not a political activist at first, but who became one, and someone I've interviewed a couple of different times at great length, is Gloria White Hammond, who is co-pastor. Let me show you, these are some of the images. See her eyes. And this is Gloria in the front. She has short hair, but that's her. She is co-pastor with her husband of an African Methodist Episcopal Church in Boston. Starting in 2000, Hammond traveled several times to Sudan, to South Sudan, with other ministers and some members of her congregation to perform these dramatic and often emotionally powerful slave redemptions. And then White Hammond, who's probably a very quiet person, returned to Boston to become a media activist, giving public lectures, interviewed by scores of news outlets, from the Boston Globe to the AARP newsletter. She just makes herself available to anybody. She's very, even though quiet, very powerful and marvelous as a figure, as a speaker. One of the members of her church is a TV personality, and she made a television documentary about Gloria Hammond, who always wants to be called Pastor Gloria, so I'm going to call her Hammond, but it's hard. On her work in Sudan, so there's a TV documentary of her work called The Glory from the God, quoting somebody in Sudan. Like other activists on behalf of persecuted Christians, White Hammond drew a picture. When she talks often, tells this story. There was a young girl saying she was a slave. Her arm was grossly deformed because when she was taken, she was tied up and dragged behind a horse. And she said, "Thank you for returning me." A year after her first trip, White Hammond co-founded an organization to support women in Sudan called My Sister's Keeper. The biblical inflection would not have been missed by any of the faithful. The suffering in Sudan became a spectacle that did American cultural work. The images of slave bodies, horrific yet triumphant. The presumptions of transnational racial solidarity, which were also worked to make a community across Sudanese and American people. So there were Sudanese involved in My Sister's Keeper eventually. And the role of Christians in Sudan, whose stories bring together Black and white Christians in the United States, both of whom were working on this issue of slave redemptions, had a very powerful effect of making connections among Black and white Christians. And then again, it makes this simple moral claim that we should respond to those who suffer. I'd like to argue that there's a continuum of the bodies of Paul Carlson and Wormbrand and the images we see of the bodies in Sudan. Although something profound has also changed. Circulating in the multimedia universe of the early 21st century, these new spectacles of suffering are part of a highly articulated visual culture in which global South Christians, rather than white missionaries, are exemplary believers, and Protestant global solidarity is constructed through and on the wounded bodies of the faithful. Through this long transformation, one thing has remained constant. Spectacles of persecution have become central for an American evangelical community anxiously but inevitably negotiating its own globalization.